If you hang around my mother's family for any length of time, you'll eventually hear the story of Great Uncle Ed and the grizzly bear. My Great Uncle Ed is a man from another era, a hunter, an outdoorsman. He knows the Rocky Mountains and everything that lives at them. He can make a man twice his height feel half his size just by his pure presence. He prefers to hunt with a bow, and the bow that he draws has a draw which Odysseus would balk at. Back when he was a young man, grizzly bears were believed to be extinct in the Colorado Rocky Mountain region. But he knew that he'd been seeing scat and tracks in the region, and so he knew that one day he would find evidence that would prove the Fish and Wildlife Department wrong. Unfortunately, one day he found more evidence than he was looking for. Storytelling to create communal bonds is probably as old as our species. Long before we learned to write things down, we had already developed flourishing oral traditions. And it was in such an oral culture that the words of the Old Testament and eventually the New Testament were composed. Many of the words of Scripture did not take shape for the first time with ink on a page. They did not spring fully formed from a single human head, nor were they whispered by a divine spirit to an individual sitting alone in a room. Many of the words of Scripture were proclaimed for the first time in public spaces, and then repeated in rituals, in people's homes, on holidays, perhaps for generations before they were ever written down. The relationship between the oral culture of ancient Israel and the composition of the text is complex and diverse. Some portions of the text, for example, a portion of the epistles, might be a near verbatim transcription of an author's words put down by an amanuensis, a scribe who was taking dictation. Another portion of the text, say a prophetic oracle or the sayings of Jesus, might be a relatively accurate quotation of a historical figure that was passed down like a popular proverb from one person to the next over the course of generations before it was finally recorded. At the beginning of the Gospel of Luke and at the end of the Gospel of John, that's precisely what the authors tell us they are doing, writing down an oral tradition about Jesus. Still, another portion of the text might be a popular version of a folktale, or even multiple versions of a folktale combined into one harmonized whole. Ultimately, the degree to which a text employs oral sources and how those sources are used varies considerably. One day, my Uncle Ed came across a narrow ledge into a clearing, and on the other side he saw a grizzly bear, which the Fish and Wildlife Department said was extinct. She was a mother, so there was no way she was going to leave him alone. She charged. There was nowhere to run except a long fall down a steep scree slope. He had only his bow with him, which would be useless against a grizzly bear, so he fell into the fetal position while she attacked. She ripped up his arms, back, and legs. He desperately tried to crawl away back toward the ledge, and while he was crawling, his hand fell on one of the arrows which had been knocked from his quiver in the scuffle. He stabbed back over his shoulder 1, 2, 3 times, and incredibly, she backed away and left him alone. His last thrust had hit her in the jugular. Crippled and bleeding, my Uncle Ed was able to drag himself halfway down the mountain before his partners were able to bring a helicopter to rescue him and bring him to the hospital. There's more I could say. There's a whole second half to the story where Uncle Ed has to convince the Fish and Wildlife Department of his experience. But now that you've heard this part of the story, you're a little closer to being part of my family. The story I've just told you is only one version of the story. My mom's version of the story takes 4 hours and involves a lot of unforeseen twists and turns. When we used to tell this as children, the cousins would always focus in on the gore and the blood and the wounds. And when my great Uncle Ed tells it, he always ends with a huge bear hug, just to prove to you that his arms healed up just fine from the grizzly bear attack. The point is, stories which exist in an oral culture as opposed to a literary culture often exist in more than one version at the same time. Oral cultures are comfortable with the plurality of versions. One of the oldest parts of the Hebrew Bible may be the Song of the Sea, or the Song of Miriam, both found in the 15th chapter of Exodus, right after the Hebrew people have crossed through the Red Sea and Pharaoh's army has been drowned. These two songs might even be one and the same. The refrain, which Miriam is singing to the women in the 21st verse, is almost the same as the first line of the Song of the Sea. Sing to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously. Horse and rider he has thrown into the sea. When there are two very similar fragments in the text side by side, it often indicates that the authors are trying to preserve two versions of the same story, perhaps competing oral traditions. Maybe the Song of the Sea is one and the same as the song in Miriam, and the refrain, which Miriam sings, is intended to be sung after each line or each several lines, like a call and response. It sometimes surprises people that the oldest words in the Bible might be credited to a woman. Songs and poetry are ancient methods that oral cultures use to preserve their communal narrative because they're easier to memorize. Just think how many lyrics you have memorized without really trying. Christmas songs, pop songs, theme songs, advertising jingles, even nursery rhymes. Part of understanding this strange book of books is recognizing that we have a very different relationship with text than the people who were alive when it was written. We live in a textually oriented culture. We don't trust something just because someone says it. We want to see it in writing to know that it's true. But for most of human history, everyone was illiterate. The predominant method of passing on information through most of history was for the elders to tell stories to the children. And in songs or poetry, oral culture is capable of pretty accurate transmission even over the course of many generations. Everyone was singing Miriam's song, perhaps for hundreds of years, before it was ever written down. Some people don't like the idea that the Bible is beholden to an oral culture that was around long before it was written, composed, redacted, and put into its final form. They feel that it makes the Bible too unreliable, too muddy, too imprecise. They're the kind of people that if they spent enough time around my family to learn all the different versions of Uncle Ed and the Grizzly Bear, would ask, which version is the true version? What they might not understand is that while it's true that in an oral culture they tolerate a plurality of versions of any given story, in another way, oral cultures are actually much more conservative than literary cultures. In an oral culture, a story never belongs to a single author. When I tell my version of Uncle Ed and the Grizzly Bear, there are certain things about it I simply can't change. Uncle Ed always knows about the bears before he goes into the mountain. He's always hunting with only a bow. He always encounters the bears in such a way that he is unable to escape. And the bear is not the enemy in the story, the Fish and Wildlife Department is. I can't change these things because the story belongs to my family, not to me. So it is with the Bible. Even before they started writing down the words in this strange book of books, it already belonged to a community, and the authors who wrote it were part of that community and were bound to that history. They could no more invent things than I could tell you a story where Uncle Ed didn't wrestle the grizzly bear.